The Creed of a Credulous Person. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. The Creed of a Credulous Person by G.K. Chesterton. An example of the truth of fairy tales. I have not heard as much as I ought to have heard of a beautiful set of fairy tales called The Magic City. They are written by Miss Netta Surrett and published by Lawrence and Bullen. There are other fairy tales in the volume, but this particular series differs from all the rest as a thing of imagination differs from a thing of ingenuity. It turns upon the idea of children in a radiant ignorance misunderstanding the names of various places in the heart of London. In taking them literally, they take them poetically. Thus they suppose that Tokenhouse Yard means a place stored with the symbols of memory, and that Child's Hill means a turbulent mountain of babies. In the best of all stories, full of the most exquisite realization of the identity of mysticism and humor, the story called Paternoster Row, the child asks her father where he is going, and he answers, "To Paternoster Row for my sins." And out of the conjunction of the word sins and the great word paternoster, the child gives birth to a somber yet comforting vision of monks passing in continual procession along a cloister saying the Lord's Prayer for the sins of mankind. Now, in a fairy tale like this, people may take all sorts of different views. Some people, I believe, are worried about whether they ought to teach children anything so fictitious. Others, while admitting the fiction and its danger, think that such inventions improve the imagination. But I am in a rather peculiar difficulty, for the truth is that I believe much more in the actual existence of the child's Paternoster Row than I do in that Paternoster Row in which the father professed belief. He, an isolated, uncorroborated man of business, who is also, by the way, a character in a fairy tale, said he was going to Paternoster Row. Was he? He may have been going to play baccarat at the club. Of his movements I am uncertain, but that there is somewhere in the universe a great communion of saints praying for the sins of the gentlemen who play baccarat at the club, I am far more certain. I am entirely on the side of the children. I think they are not merely more poetic and amusing, but more practically correct. It is not the children who are dreamy or stupid because they think the name of Paternoster Row more important than the fact about it. The name of it is more important than the fact about it. The fact only means paper warehouses and banana skins and the late Mr. Kinsett's shop. The name of it means the sublimest of all ideas of the sublimest of all religions. The name was true centuries before the fact and will be centuries afterwards. That is my trouble. I know that the children are right. There is one disadvantage which is involved in the very nature of education. That is, that we have to assume that grown-up people are representative. We have even to go the length of assuming grown-up people are sane. While we talk about encouraging health in children and discouraging morbidity, when we talk of such and such a child being abnormal or interesting, or neurotic or a genius, we are all the time taking for granted that we ourselves have attained to what is profitable and eternal in human nature. But there is at least something that may reasonably be said upon the other side. It may at least very plausibly be maintained that it is children who are, age after age, sane and reliable, and grown-up people who are, age after age, more or less fantastic and disconcerting. The great majority of grown-up people in any age will be in all probability slightly insane. For since no human philosophy is perfect, and since every human philosophy naturally treats itself as if it were perfect, the chances are in every generation that the majority of educated people will be ecstatically certain of something that is quite untrue. Children, on the other hand, it might be maintained, represent the actual primary and untouched human nature. Whatever agrees with that is sane. Whatever disagrees with it is eccentric. children are always children. Or, to limit the matter with more precision, babies, at any rate, are always babies. But few will be so paradoxical as to maintain that men are always men, or women always women. The mother always has to do with an infant, but it does not always happen that the infant has to do with a mother. Sometimes the infant has to compose his intellect to endure the vagaries, not of a mother, but of a Protestant, or a Socialist, or a Buddhist, or an artist, or an educationist, or a person with a theory, or a person with a grievance, or a person with a temperament. Whatever the parent is, it is 1,000,000 to 1 that he or she is not what the baby is, a normal and impartial human being. Grass is grass everywhere, because it does not grow more than a foot above the soil. But the great trees are tossed and twisted by successive storms until they have every frantic shape in the sketch-book of Gustave Doré, until they look like griffins and octopi, dragons and devils. The respective destinies of the infantile and the adult are not unlike those under which the weak grass is always healthy, while the strong trees go mad. For while children remain an immortal testimony to the constant quality of humanity, their grave fathers and mothers are century after century blown about by every wind of doctrine. It would be very easy to give instances of this possible rightness in children, and this possible wrongness in all their pastors and masters. For example, we may happen to complain that a child is morbid because he is frightened of devils, does not like to be left alone in the dark, or is full of any way of the sense of an evil occultism. Now, of course, it may be true that the child is morbidly exceptional because he is afraid of devils. But on the other hand, it is also possible that we, the grown-ups, are morbidly exceptional because we are not afraid of devils. That is to say, it is quite a discussable contention that this fear of darkness and the things which have been said to dwell in it is a normal recurrent human passion, a passion which can only be driven out of life to return by another entry, which can only be smashed by Voltaire to reappear in Maeterlinck. And if that is true, I do not say it is true, I only say it is tenable, it is quite possible that the child who screams at a shadow is a healthy and representative human being, while the mother who comforts him and the doctor who explains his fears are a couple of quite singular neurotics, the by-products of a subtle civilization. The only question is whether this fear of the unknown is a natural human attitude. Or again, we may say that our boys are far too violent. It does not occur to us to ask whether we are far too sensitive. We say they make too much noise. We never cast a conjecture on the matter of whether we require too much silence. We say that boys fight, and we assume that they are very wrong to fight. They may be very wrong to fight, but again, we may be very wrong not to fight. It is again quite possible that they represent the normal. It may be that fighting is brutal, and therefore inhuman, but on the other hand, it may be that fighting is human, and in that case a vast part of our civilization is inhuman, and peace is of all things the most inhuman. In the same way, I venture to suggest a doubt which I will develop in a further article, but a doubt which has with me become a cold certainty. I am quite certain that all good fairy tales are true. End of section 1.
Section 2 of The Creed of a Credulous Person. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. The Creed of a Credulous Person by G.K. Chesterton. Pumpkins and Possibilities. The moral problem of the teaching of fairy tales is, as I have said, generally propounded to us by gloomy and excited realists in this form: how can you teach your children what is untrue? But this, from my point of view, makes one most extravagant and startling assumption. It assumes that I know the fairy tales to be untrue. As a matter of fact, I have no means whatever for forming an opinion about the matter. I am in the question of a good agnostic, and a good agnostic is a man who does not know why Cinderella's pumpkin should not have been turned into a stagecoach. I deny altogether that there is, or can be, any philosophical reason for supposing that the supernatural does not happen. I am not conscious of any experiences whatever between the hour of my birth and the present moment, which give me the smallest reason to suppose that miracles do not happen, and that fairy godmothers transform pumpkins. I have seen a great many pumpkins that did not become coaches, and I have seen a great many coaches which had not, at any time while I was looking at them, been pumpkins. And there, as far as I can carefully estimate the matter, my knowledge on the question comes to an end. How any amount of experiences of pumpkins that remain pumpkins, and coaches that remain coaches, can throw any light on the difficulty, I have never been able to understand. When the scientific people say that the uniformity of nature shows that a miracle is impossible, I am afraid that my thoughts are not quite as serious as they ought to be. I am afraid the remark reminds me, more than anything else, of the Irishman who was prepared to confront the witnesses who had seen him commit murder, with no less than 40 reliable witnesses who had not seen him commit the crime. Only this morning, while I was in bed, a curious event occurred. I did not see it myself, but I have heard it on authority which disposes of the notion of mere journalistic sensationalism or servant's tattle. While the whole of the sky was still comparatively dark, a curious pallid or phosphorescent effect was noticeable near the horizon, which, after turning into the most various and alarming colors, like some display of fireworks, spat out a sort of globe or disk of fire, the conflagration of which was so furious that it lit up the whole earth and sky with a ghastly splendor for the space of several hours. I have been unable to discover any explanation of the phenomenon. I have, it is true, met a certain number of people who seem to think that they have an explanation, but their attempts to exhibit it only showed that they had no notion of what an explanation means. For all they could tell me about the prodigy, as far as I can make it out, was that it happened before, and that it happened a great many times before, that by a curious coincidence it had happened the very day before, and the very day before that. They also seemed to think it very important that they had invented an odd monosyllabic sound for it. They said it was the sun, or only the sun, and repeated sun again and again, waving their arms with a kind of excited rationality. The fact that it happened every morning they called the order of nature. I said to them, "My dear people, I don't know what you mean. I didn't ask you how often it had happened, or what noise you made when you pointed at it. I asked you why it happened. If it has happened 1,000,000 times, it is 1,000,000 times more extraordinary than if it had happened only once. Come, I put it to you, if I were to walk past your house in a dressing gown and a horse guard's helmet, and you ask why, would you be satisfied with the answer that my name was Brown, and that I had done it ever since I was 3 years old? You would want to know why I did it. I want to know why the sun rises." One of them cleared his throat in a benevolent way. "Oh, I can tell you that," he said. "The sun does not really rise. It is this earth on which we stand, which, by the law of its nature, turns at that moment towards the sun." At his remarks there was a low hum of applause, as if we were in church. I looked at him with a sort of idiot vacancy. "God in heaven!" I cried. "And if I walked past your house in a dressing gown and a helmet, would you go to sleep again quite contented because somebody told you that it was your house that walked past me?" Consequently, my position is very simple, though somewhat blank. Since I know of no reason why ordinary things should happen, I cannot know of any reason why extraordinary things should not happen. If the sun suddenly did not rise tomorrow morning, a great many people would, I firmly believe, be thrown into considerable agitation. To me, the conduct of the sun in not rising would be much more quiet and respectable than his habit of careering through the sky like a rocket. And I, who have not even the outline of a notion of why pumpkins grow from yellow flowers, cannot pretend to have an outline of a notion of why coaches should not grow from pumpkins. The incident may be rare, like triplets, or startling, like a flash of lightning, or hitherto unclassified, like the first manifestation of argon. But that it is impossible seems to me a dogma only imaginable in the mouth of an insane pope. I know I live in an age in which I can look into a box and see a live man's backbone. I know I can shoot information at a man across leagues of space without sight, smell, or hearing. And when a child asks me, did Cinderella's godmother really change the pumpkin into a coach? I should incline, after grave consideration, to reply as follows. The thing is by no means improbable, but, of course, one must allow for errors in these journalistic sensations. Huxley made it an argument against miracles or wonders that every man really based his life upon the assumption that the order of nature was constant and continuous. But surely there is here a confusion. Every man bases his life on the assumptions that a miracle is not probable, and would be a fool if he did not. But what every man bases his life on is not the assumption that miracles do not happen, but simply the assumption that improbable things do not happen. That assumption, of course, is quite incorrect, for they often do. Still, it is the only working hypothesis. It is perfectly scientific and possible. It is quite within the laws of nature that if I drink a glass of milk in a milk shop, it should be deliberately poisoned. But I no more think of assuming in practical life that a woman I have never seen will poison me than I think of assuming that she will turn into a griffin. For practical purposes, it is quite enough that a thing is enormously unlikely, and if a miracle were not enormously unlikely, it would not be a miracle at all. Certainly, the ordinary householder does not buy a pumpkin under the impression that it will afford an excellent private carriage to take his wife out to pay calls. But neither, for the matter of that, does he buy a pumpkin with the idea that it will be full of gunpowder and blow him and his wife sky high. Yet it would doubtless be a great comfort to them, in their last moments, to know that the latter process is quite consistent with the ascertained laws of chemistry. Feeling, therefore, that the current notion of the improbability of fables, prodigies, and fairy tales is quite unreasonable, I have re-examined them with some care in the last short period, and I have come to the following conclusions. I will deal with them separately in 2 or 3 ensuing articles, but I will summarize them approximately now. I think it is probable that there are fairies. I am quite certain that Santa Claus really gives children presents. It is, of course, perfectly obvious that animals talk as in Aesop. I think it almost, but not quite, certain that dolls have a personality. I feel it to be the least unlikely of the 2 alternatives that all things called inanimate are really animate, as in Hans Andersen. And for these views, I propose to give a seriatim, and, with a great sense of responsibility, my solid and scientific reasons. End of Section 2. Recorded by Olivia.
Section 3 of The Creed of a Credulous Person. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Read by Dean Christian Rasco. The Creed of a Credulous Person by G.K. Chesterton. On being taken in. There is a curious and interesting phrase which is commonly used by skeptical persons, both wise and foolish, and which throws a flood of light on the whole nature of skepticism, that is, on the whole humbug of skepticism. It is uttered 10 times a day in the chatter of Vanity Fair. It is the first and last colloquialism of all who pride themselves on their coolness and their common sense, and yet it reveals in itself the whole of their eternal error. Whenever you ask these people to believe anything, whether it be a legend of the heroes, or a Cock Lane ghost, a rap on the table, or a transfiguration on a mountain, they reply in the phrase that they are not to be taken in. I have not the least idea what was the real origin of the phrase. I can quite imagine all the explanations that will be found in the dictionaries and all the theories of all the philologists. I could, if necessary, make them all up myself. I can imagine how Grigg propounded his simple but now exploded theory that the phrase was an abbreviation of taken in a net. I can fancy the more ingenious Piffer destroying this with the theory that nets were not in use at the time assigned to the origin of the expression, and that it simply means taken in the act. I can reconstruct the theory of Huck's, that remarkable man, which connected the phrase with the subject of the symbolic mistletoe, but I cannot at this moment remember how. I can tell you all about Pinker and his description of the taking in of the secondary neophytes into the Temple of Hathor, and how they were subjected to some crushing disappointment as a test of their devotion, hence the modern idea of being taken in. I have all possible respect for the reputation of Skip, the philologist, who suggests that taking in is a corruption of tacking in, a nautical term. Even Dr. Borg, who traces it to the old Danish word tagkenen, to eat raw meat, I regard with a good deal of forbearance. I feel gently toward those eminent men, more especially as they are, among their many other honors, the creatures of my own imagination. But I repeat that whatever may be the origin of the term, as it stands, it is most startlingly significant. It reveals, as I say, the whole weakness of skepticism. To refuse to be taken in is to refuse to see the inside of anything. The phrase originated, I should imagine, in some dim and cruel time, when a man refused to be taken into the house of his best friend, lest there should be men behind the door with daggers. I do not blame a man under those circumstances for such caution, but I do say that if he refused to go in, while he had a perfect right to boast of his own wisdom, or to thank God for his deliverance, there is one thing that he had no right at all to do. He had no right to talk about the house into which he did not go, to describe the thinness of the carpet, the raggedness of the curtains, the badness of the wine, the incomparable amateurishness of the watercolors. Because they wished to murder him, as he thought, is no reason that he should lie about them. All that he has a right to say is that while they may have wanted to give him a good dinner, they may also have wanted to stick a knife in his back. All that anyone has a right to say in answer to him is that while they may have wanted to stick a knife in his back, they may have wanted to give him a good dinner. In any case, he was not taken in. On the contrary, he was left standing outside. But the skeptic is left in this position in regard to everything. You show him a great palace and tell him that inside are great councils and splendid judgments of state, but he never sees the councils or hears the judgments, for the simple reason that he will not be taken in to see or hear them. You show him a mighty cathedral and tell him that inside it are ceremonies that exalt the spirit, music that makes it mad with a frantic goodness, but he never hears the service or the music, simply because he will not be taken in to hear them. He has an abiding horror of the inside of everything, for to him the inside of everything is a trap, with jaws of steel. He would rather be outside of everything than inside heaven, for even in heaven, though he were 7 times blessed and absolved, he would feel throughout the divine ages that at any moment the gates of gold and pearl might clang together and imprison him, and the angels of mercy and justice turn into omnipotent devils and go through the city with flaming swords, destroying all within, even against the promise of God. To this kind of man, it is too great a risk to be inside anything. That is all very well, but it does most definitely follow that these people, though thoroughly justified, intellectually speaking, in their whole position, must be bad judges of almost everything there is. The great majority of things have externally a doubtful air. They may be either traps or cathedrals. And of the great majority of men is demanded the furious, the fantastic, but still the practically necessary valor of assuming that the thing is a cathedral. All the most practical and recurrent human attitudes consist chiefly of being taken in, that is, of being introduced. Whenever we are introduced, we are taken in to some new and dangerous matter, falling in love, motherhood, and even going to sleep are all very dangerous. And though keeping out of a trap is a very good way of achieving about 100 excellent objects, while it means eating meals, admiring the sunrise, living to a green old age, and being admired for wisdom, it still does not achieve everything. It is a very bad way of finding out what traps are like. And yet the whole universe is a trap. Look at the great empty skies above you, and there will be moods when you will see them as the hollow jaws of a gaping giant, the awful throat of a monster in whom we are, our heads in the lion's mouth. And yet there is only one word to be said in the matter. Either it is better to be inside or to be outside. There are some who think that in entering this existence they have been tricked into a man-trap. But there are far more who think, and they range from Socrates to Zulus, that they have been taken into a cathedral. In any case, those who grumble at the universe have no right to criticize it. Only the credulous succeed. And there is but one antithesis to be put in the matter. If a man cannot be taken in, let him be taken out. End of section 3.
Section 4 of the Creed of a Credulous Person. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Bruce McCready. The Creed of a Credulous Person by G.K. Chesterton. Section 4. Is furniture alive? Nobody can possibly imagine what would happen if agnostics really became agnostic. No one can say, that is, what would happen if the modern skeptical mind ceased to be quite certain about everything. Genuine agnosticism would no doubt make a very great revolution in the tradition of our lives. But what would be the bold and general features of that great revolution? It is very difficult to predict with certainty. One thing, however, may be considered as fairly certain. If agnosticism came properly into play, one thing or class of things would at any rate happen. We should have ghost stories in every street in London. We should have fairy stories in every village in England. We should have the cry of the witches in every high wind, and the grin of Robin Goodfellow in every act of the household, from the breaking of the breakfast service to the pleasant taste of the supper. This is real agnosticism, to be attracted to elves and afraid of specters. For precisely the thing which has always made these notions important, precisely the thing which has always made fairies attractive and ghosts disquieting, has been the eternal attitude of man, the eternal attitude of agnosticism. Once admit that we do know that fairies are, and they are no more attractive than F's. Once admit that we do know that a ghost can walk, and he becomes a good deal less dangerous than any harmless old vicar dawdling about in the moonlight. The thing which has given life to all the superstitions is this ancient and mystic thing, agnosticism. Peasants and old women can frighten us with their tales precisely because they are philosophically right. They do not know why such things should not be, but yet do not absolutely know that they are. Modern agnostics summarize the views of the peasants and old women by saying that they are beliefs born of ignorance. Ignorance is a Latin word which means agnosticism. Now, this genuine agnostic attitude is the one which, as I have said, I recommend in the case of the beliefs of children, not only as the most wise answer to their questions, but as the only honest answer. Let us take the question of the personality of inanimate objects. If a child says, Does my doll really think? The only truthful answer is, I do not know. You know more about it than I do. To pretend that we do know of any argument against things of the kind thinking is extravagant. All we know about tables and chairs is that they do not adopt our way of expressing themselves. They are apparently deaf and dumb and blind, and therefore separated from us. But then, for the matter of that, we may strike them as deficient in some organ of communication which they possess, and through which they conduct a gay and complex social life. Through this organ they may be, so to speak, winking at us all day, shouting at us all day, digging us in the waistcoat and kicking us on the shins all day. They may be sending up glorious rockets to blind men and playing divine oratorios to deaf ones. And if anyone thinks that a chair or a Dutch doll cannot have a life because it comes into existence in a curious way and is made up of odds and ends, I think he needs to learn a cosmic humility, and that which is almost the same thing, a cosmic sense of humor. In what sort of way do we come into existence? And of what sort of odds and ends are we made of? Another thing that people forget about the things called lifeless or motionless is that motion is very considerably a matter of time. It is true that to us who flower and fade for the feverish interlude of 80 years and 10, an armchair appears to be motionless. But for all we know from the point of view of a thing which lives 100 times longer than an armchair, the armchair may appear quite vivacious. The armchair may be waving its arms like an orator addressing a mob. It may be throwing its legs about like a sailor dancing a hornpipe. To us who live less than 100 years, its atoms appear stationary. To others, the atoms may appear as pouring and mingling and eddying like the bubbles of a waterfall. To people who live 1,000,000 years, it may appear to move with slow and solemn gestures reminiscent of the old school. To people who live 2,000,000 years, it may appear to have movements which are easy and modern. To people who live 4,000,000 years, it may appear to gesticulate like an Italian in a rage, for it is, as I say, merely a matter of time. And I belong to the philosophical school of Mrs. Snagsby in Bleak House, who, when her husband remarked that it was time for tea, answered, "What time to eternity?" If a flash of lightning had a personality and could write its reminiscences, it would undoubtedly regard the instant of time in which it lit up the landscape as a long and comfortable and valuable lifetime. It would regard the unearthly incandescence which made all things ghastly for a second as the steady benignity of a summer sun. And just as we open our eyes as infants and see the trees in a certain attitude, and we close them as corpses while the trees remain in the same attitude, so it would be with the life of the lightning. It would open its blinding eyes when a clerk was hailing a hansom cab, and close them forever before he had lowered his umbrella. So that to the lightning, that clerk would be what a mountain or a pine tree is to us, a thing not only motionless, but incapable of motion. The lightning would see men not as trees walking, but as trees standing still. To that momentary soul, all the contortions and energies of our human life would only be like the varied shapes of a silent and unstirring forest. The hand of a man lifted to strike his friend in a startled drawing-room would be only the crooked bough standing out from an ancient oak. The mouth of a man just opened to speak would only be the hole in the hollow tree. All our movements would be frozen into perpetuity. The man who has stumbled on his hands and knees would be a quadruped. The man who was leaping over a fence would be a flying bird. It is at least possible that this is really the case with the things that we call inanimate: stones, trees, houses, armchairs, dolls, and hobby horses. It may be that they express themselves with a fine patriarchal leisure, which our lives are too short to cultivate. It may be that they have the grand air of gentlemen, and we only the hurry of journalists. Perhaps it takes a beech tree some little time, say 90 years, to make an observation about the weather. Perhaps in the course of a century and a decade or so, an elm may have thought of and uttered a very witty reply, immediately followed by 40 years later by the applause of the whole forest, uttered in shouts at intervals of 3 years apart. It may be that, like the lightning, we drop in at nature's great at home rather too late and leave a trifle too early, thus missing a good deal of the cosmic fun. It may be that the stones and the trees are, so to speak, human beings, and that we are only thunderbolts. End of section 4.
Section 5 of the Creed of a Credulous Person. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. The Creed of a Credulous Person by G.K. Chesterton. My Experiences of Santa Claus. The near approach of Christmas, which the eternal idealism of mankind has expressed in the proverbial phrase which describes it as coming, makes it particularly appropriate that I should deal with the existence and peculiarities of Santa Claus. But this is even more necessary because he is the one example of a matter of unimpeachable common sense. Skeptics may throw doubt upon the existence of pixies or brownies. Ingenious doubts may be raised even against dragons. By dint of a little paradox and superficial sparkle, people may make what looks like a plausible case against the existence of hippogriffs. Of mermaids, I confess that I have had doubts myself in early youth, and though I am sure about giants with 3 heads, yet this assurance is of the nature of a dim and delicate spiritual intuition. But about Santa Claus, at any rate, I am on perfectly solid ground. My conviction of his existence and beneficence began faintly in early childhood, and has continuously increased ever since. It is the fashion with an enormous number of modern people to maintain, or rather to take for granted, that as the world has progressed it has come to believe less and less in spirits and more in materials. And in the same way it is their custom to maintain, or rather to take for granted, that as we go on in life from infancy to old age, we believe less and less in Santa Claus. Both views are false, or at least insufficiently true. The truth is that progress, whether it be the progress of mankind, from the cavern of the Hotel Cecil, or the progress of an individual, as the florid clergyman expressed it, from the bassinet to the sepulchre, it is so motley and complicated a thing that by choosing instances and arguments with reasonable controversial care, one can represent it to have been anything at all. No doubt one can make a plausible statement that our race has become more and more rationalistic and less mystical. One can quote on its side the disappearance of medicine men, of tests at Oxford and Cambridge, of witch-finding, and the Irish Church establishment, and the introduction of books on psychology, and the late Mr. Bradlaugh. But I would, by the same method, undertake plausibly to maintain that the world had been growing more and more red and less green. I could quote the introduction of pillar boxes, terracotta statuettes, and socialist neckties, and I could quote the disappearance of Fenian societies, country districts, green poplin, and the costume of Robin Hood. In the same way I could make out that young people liked everything that was round, and that old people liked everything that was square, instancing on the one side boys eating buns and babies crying for the moon, and citing on the other the fondness of old gentlemen for cards, books, newspapers, and chessboards. In all these cases clearly our error would have been an insufficient breadth of experience and example. The modern popularity of green absinthe would have upset the first theory. The second would have sadly taken wing after the experiment of bringing a child into the neighborhood of a square biscuit. In the same way, there are scores of examples to upset the theory that a high civilization has outgrown mysticism, examples which range from the philosophers of India to the palmists of Bond Street, from the Neoplatonists to Mrs. Eddy, from the Egyptian pontiffs to Sir William Crookes. And if an example be required to upset the theory that advancing years destroy our belief in Santa Claus, I beg most modestly to present myself as that exception. What has happened to me has been the very reverse of what appears to be the experience of most of my friends. Instead of dwindling to a point, Santa Claus has grown larger and larger in my life until he fills almost the whole of it. It happened in this way. As a child, I was faced with a phenomenon requiring explanation. I hung up at the end of my bed an empty stocking, which in the morning became a full stocking. I had done nothing to produce the things that filled it. I had not worked for them or paid for them, or made them or helped to make them. I had not even been good, far from it. And the explanation offered was that a certain being, whom people called Santa Claus, was benevolently disposed towards me. Of course, most people who talk about these things get into a state of some mental confusion by attaching tremendous importance to the name of the entity. We call him Santa Claus because everyone called him Santa Claus. But the name of a god is a mere human label. His real name may have been Williams. It may have been the Archangel Uriel. What we believed was that a certain benevolent agency did give us those toys for nothing. And as I say, I believe it still. I have merely extended the idea. Then I only wondered who put the toys in the stocking. Now I wonder who put the stocking by the bed, and the bed in the room, and the room in the house, and the house on the planet, and the great planet in the void. Once I only thanked Santa Claus for a few dolls and crackers. Now I thank him for stars and street faces and wine and the great sea. Once I thought it delightful and astonishing to find a present so big that it only went halfway into the stocking. Now I am delighted and astonished every morning to find a present so big that it takes 2 stockings to hold it, and then leaves a great deal outside. It is the large and preposterous present of myself, as to the origin of which I can offer no suggestion, except that Santa Claus gave it to me in a fit of peculiar, fantastic goodwill. End of section 5. End of the Creed of a Credulous Person by G. K. Chesterton.